Hello, I'm Dr. Newman. This is History of the English Language. We're getting into the out of the early modern period of the modern period today. We're getting into the 700s at least, and joining me today is my friend and one of my favorite dead white men, meme lord and lexicographer Samuel Johnson. Pictured here, Samuel Johnson wrote the first attempt at a comprehensive dictionary of the English language. He's also sometimes called the father of literary criticism. He wrote a great deal on English literature and is a fine essayist. He was on the wrong side of the Revolutionary War, being British and rather critical of the colonists' wishes for independence. But he did get one pretty fair and sick burn off when he talked about how it was funny that the loudest cries for liberty came from the harshest drivers of slaves. So maybe he invented critical race theory too. No, that wasn't him. It was Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and a few others. Hello? Okay, let's talk about prescriptivism. What is prescriptivism? Prescriptivism is the opposite of descriptivism. A descriptive approach to language attempts to say how people actually use language. What are the forms actually evidenced, right? Prescriptive says how people should use language. What is correct and incorrect? For a descriptivist, which modern linguistics is, there's no good or bad. I mean, there are ungrammatical things, which is if you say a form of a sentence that's not comprehensible or seems wrong to a native speaker of that language, then it's wrong, right? But it's not wrong in that you created an error. It's not grammatical. Whereas prescriptive, something can be comprehensible. It might be an utterance that is performed in normal circumstances by a native speaker, but a prescriptivist will say, well, you didn't follow the rules, which I wrote down here. And so we're going to talk about the development of prescriptivism in England from 1500 to 1800. And it's a very important topic because prescriptivism is the reason why the English language and English grammar basically stopped changing after the 1700s. And if history is both the study of change and continuity, then prescriptivism has a great deal to account for in terms of the continuity of the English language. So let's go to the next slide and talk about a little bit about various abortive attempts to standardize and to prescribe spelling. As early as 1569, a guy named John Hart wanted to eliminate superfluous letters like double consonants and extra E's. A guy named William Bullochar devised a 40-letter phonetic alphabet so that there would be symbols for sounds like ch and sh and th, and various other sounds that are represented by 2 letters in the English language. More influential was Richard Mulcaster, who compiled a list of hard words. Remember, this is during the Inkhorn period. And he formulated some rules for spelling, like silent final E indicating long vowel, as in mad and maid. And it used to be sometimes they would do it with a double vowel, like in boot. We still have a few examples of that because nobody's attempt to standardize the spelling of English ever really took. Edmund Coote was another fellow who wrote a hard word list that was popular and reprinted a number of times through the 17th century. A guy named Robert Caudry who was on the side of the anti-Inkhorn side of the debate, attempted to standardize diction and stop the influx of loanwords. Oh dear, my light just ran out. Oh well. Guess I'll just look a little washed out. Henry Cochrane wrote an aid to understanding difficult authors. There were a number of people who were starting to write aids to understanding English and to standardizing English and to standardizing spelling before any other efforts took place. Now, in France, there was a kind of where the royal government was more absolutist and exerted more control in a number of ways. They established a national academy, and there were similar academies were also established in Spain and in Italy. And the Académie Française was established in 1635 by Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister to Louis XIII. You might know Cardinal Richelieu if you ever read The Three Musketeers. He's a character. It was suppressed in 1793 under the French Revolution, but restored in 1803 by Napoleon. There are always 40 members. They are always chosen from the most elite scholars, writers, and authors, academics in the country, and they are known informally as les immortels, the undying ones, the immortals. And the Académie Française in France acts as the unofficial authority in the language. It publishes the official dictionary, and it makes rulings that are advisory and not technically binding. Like, individual editors don't have to abide by the rulings of the Académie Française, but they tend to. And they adjudicate over various controversies. Like, there was a controversy in French over whether you could have la professeuse, the feminine form of professor, as well as le professeur. And for a long time, I was like, no, you can't have that. And then I don't know where they are on that right now. Mostly, they're trying to keep English loanwords out of the language. There's the similar Office of the French Language in Quebec, which is even more rigorous about keeping out English loanwords than the Académie Française. There were efforts to establish a similar academy in English, including James Howell, John Dryden, a famous poet and critic, Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, and the Journal of the Plague Year. And he said no author would have the impudence to coin without their authority. Custom, which is now our best authority for words, would always have its original here and not be allowed without it. There should be no more occasion to search for derivations and construction, and it would be as criminal then to coin words as money. He wanted a central authority to basically say which words are okay and which words aren't. Jonathan Swift, another important intellectual and writer of the period, wrote a proposal for the reformation of the English language, in which he just absolutely laid into slang, which he associated with kind of brainless young aristocrats rather than a lower class thing. And if you've ever read the Rape of the Lock, there's a section in which he makes fun of the slang using rich upper class young people. And his proposal widely circulated, but it came to nothing. Perhaps because his patron, Queen Anne, passed away, leading to the end of that period and the beginning of the Hanoverian period. Samuel Johnson is perhaps one of the biggest influences, and he was skeptical of the idea of Samuel Johnson's a really cool guy. Y'all should learn more about him. He was a poet, an essayist, a moralist, a literary critic, a biographer, an editor, a lexicographer, that is to say, a writer of dictionaries, a college dropout. It seems that he had a Tourette's syndrome and also, a meme god. His face gets used a lot, and it's like, well, it's going to have to look like, what? And he wrote, academies have been instituted to guard the avenues of their languages, to retain fugitives and repulse intruders. But their vigilance and activity have hitherto been vain. Sounds are too volatile and subtle for legal restraints. To enchain syllables and to lash the wind are equally the undertakings of pride, unwilling to measure its desires by its strength. He's basically saying, you can pass all the laws about what words people are allowed to use and what words they're not, but people are going to say what they're going to say. And I kind of agree with this. I think one of the great intellectual weaknesses of George Orwell's 1984, great a book as it is that his idea that you can restrict how people think by reducing the number of words, the whole newspeak concept, is fundamentally not supported by what we know of linguistics, which is that whatever vocabulary you give people, they will find a way of expressing what they're thinking with the tools that they have at hand, and they will always come up with new tools. So this is what Samuel Johnson wrote in the preface of his dictionary. A little bit about Samuel Johnson and his incredibly influential Dictionary of the English Language. It was written on commission for about $300,000 US in 2017 money. I don't know what that is in 2023. 350, 360. It took 9 years to write. He did it pretty much himself. And it was the preeminent dictionary in English until the completion of the Oxford English Dictionary in 1928, which took like 50, 75 years. Here's an example of a definition. Opulence, wealth, riches, affluence. And then he would give examples. There in full opulence a banker dwelt, to all the joys and pangs of riches felt. His sideboard glittered with imagined plate, and his proud fancy held a vast estate. And he quotes his friend an influenced Jonathan Swift. There's Johnson's formatting and selection of the dictionary and the authors that he chose as being exemplary. He mostly chose literary sources, not sources from everyday life or everyday documents. And this dictionary did exercise a great deal of influence on the language. It's a little less dry than you might think as a dictionary. It's filled with a number of humorous, it's got little jokes in there. Excise, a hateful tax levied upon commodities and adjudged, not by the common judges of property, but wretches hired by those to whom excise is paid. And an excise is like an import duty, like a sales tax. Lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. A little self-burn there, a little self-deprecation. Little nationalism here. There was a lot of in the 1700s. Scotland, of course, had political union with England and became the United Kingdom. So there was a lot, and in the 1700s also, there was a great deal of intellectual activity in Scotland. And Edinburgh was known as the Athens of the North. There were a number of important philosophers and thinkers, including Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, David Hume. So here it's oats, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. Oh! Monsieur, a term of reproach for a Frenchman. Monsieur. Writative, a word of Pope's, not to be imitated. Increase of years makes men more talkative, but less writative. And this is like, yes, Pope used this word, Alexander Pope, another 1700s writer. He's like, don't use this word. Anyway, some other important guys, Wallace Loudon Priestley, Joseph Priestley, Robert Louth, Buchanan, and Ashe all wrote grammars in the 18th century of what, not just of what words you can use or can't use, but how you can do your syntax, how you can put sentences together. And this is where a lot of the rules that we still use that you have to repeatedly kind of drum into a kid because they actually don't make that much sense given the internal logic of the English language itself. And this is because they're imposed often through the example or the framework of Latin, which was considered like a more perfect kind of rational language. So a lot of the rules that these 1700s, these 18th century writers agreed on was don't split infinitives. Don't say to boldly go. It's to go boldly. Whereas this had always been okay in English, but you can't split an infinitive in Latin because an infinitive is one word in Latin. Amare means to love. Cupire is to desire. Metuere is to fear. You can't. It's just one word to the infinitive. You can't put an adverb in the middle of it. Another effect of this period was that there should be no comparatives of the incomparable, such as perfect, chief, round, right? And so obviously the writers of our Constitution hadn't gotten the memo when they said in the preamble, in order to form a more perfect union. Well, you can't have a more perfect. Something's either perfect or not. So there's the influence of Latin, but there's also the influence of kind of logic and rationality, and this is really the age of rationality and reason. Taller than he rather than I am taller than he rather than I am taller than him is something. This the use of the subject rather than the object case here was a rule that came in. Him doing that versus his doing that, that you should favor the his, because doing is a noun rather than doing is an adjective modifying him. Another big thing is two negatives in English destroy one another or are equivalent to an affirmative. And this is, again, the influence of mathematics and logic and also Latin, which again, the Latin that survives to the early modern period. And the modern period was not the Latin that was spoken by your everyday Roman soldier or enslaved person, but the Latin of an elite that was trained in logic and so the mathematics. And so we got the idea that negative concord is bad. Now, of course, all of these things survive. It's just that the formal written kind of fancy dress version of the language has eliminated these. One of these was the idea of shall versus will. I shall as a future. And shall is sort of going away. It sounds really old-fashioned despite the efforts of prescriptivists to preserve it. Joseph Priestley, however, sort of went against prescriptivism a little bit. He was another writer of the time who said that he was against the idea of an academy. He was against the idea of experts telling people how to talk. And he said, look, people can talk how they talk. The general prevailing custom, whatever it happens to be, can be the only standard for the time that it prevails. That, by the way, is not just, speaking of memes, that is not Joseph Priestley. That was actually a French painter whose name Ducroix or Ducroix or something like that. And I just find the image amusing. And that is all for this video. Thank you for listening. I hope you've learned a little bit about prescriptivism and its effect on the English language. It had the effect of fossilizing it, more or less. Not quite fossilizing it, but freezing it, right? Because now we have, beginning in the 1700s and developing in the 1800s and 1900s, populations both in North America and in the UK who are more and more literate, more and more going to school, and therefore learning rules. This is right, this is wrong. And when you get writing and you get all these effects, what you get is less change, because when you don't have a language that is a prestige language where people are invested in saying, no, this is the proper way the English language is important. This is a language used for religion and government and law. We have to make sure that people are using it right. When you don't have that kind of oversight, for example, in the dialects of subaltern people, of subjugated people, then those changes will happen more quickly. I have a friend, for example, who is a native speaker of Cantonese, which is a language, a dialect of Chinese spoken in southern China and in Hong Kong. And he talks about how, or he told me how he once compared Cantonese to African-American vernacular English, in that it changes, the slang changes, usages change much more quickly than the standard kind of elite version of the language. But what happens then in both cases is that the quote-unquote substandard, the vernacular, is more creative and more generative of new words and forms that then get adopted and criticized when they get adopted into the standard form. So this is one of the, if you watch the course Core Concepts in Sociolinguistics video from this week, then that'll give you some framework in which to think about these processes of evaluation and comparison of the types of language that people use. But I hope this has clarified prescriptivism and its effect on the English language. Thank you for listening. Bye.